to including victims at the heart of the Colombian peace process, and he is considered one of the architects of the transitional justice process in Colombia. Mr. Jaramillo will discuss the participation of victims in peacemaking and negotiations, from which we can draw inspiration on how victims can be at the heart of any successful political settlement, and how acknowledgement of their suffering is the foundation for any national reconciliation. We are also pleased to hear from the Office of the Special Envoy of the Secretary General to Yemen, which will be delivered by Ms. Sheda Al-Harazi, who is the Political Affairs Coordinator and the Transitional Justice Lead at the Office of the UN Special Envoy. She was also the reporter of the Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Working Group at the National Dialogue Conference, and she has played an outstanding role in empowering civil society organizations in Yemen. Finally, with our colleague Shema, we will witness a significant and impactful step, which is the declaration of September 1st as the National Day for Transitional Justice in Yemen, representing a moral symbol and a living memory that strengthens the presence and understanding of justice in the consciousness of society and in the pathways of the future. This will be presented by Shema Abdul Hamid, an activist and a member of the Yemen Peace Forum, as well as the coordinator for the Masarat, the Pathways to Reconciliation platform. Distinguished attendees, this session is not merely the start of Transitional Justice Week activities. It is a declaration of collective will that peace in Yemen will not be achieved through politics alone, but first and foremost through justice, by acknowledging the victims and by empowering youth and civil society to be at the heart of this path, the path of transitional justice. Allow us now to start with the first activist and a member of the Yemen Peace Forum, as well as the coordinator by the deputy head of the mission and head of development and the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands on the role of transitional justice in achieving comprehensive and sustainable peace. Over to you, Bart.
Thank you very much, Isa. I'm very happy to be here, and I'd like to start my contribution with an Arab proverb, and the proverb says, "Min sabr zafar." He who is patient triumphs. And in my opinion, few sayings capture better what is required on the long road towards peace and justice. Because peace is not won in a single moment. It's built patiently, step by step, through courage and persistence. It's therefore a privilege to join you today at the opening of this important session as part of Transitional Justice Week. And this week brings together voices from Yemen and from around the world to reflect on the legacies of conflict and to explore how truth, dignity, and reconciliation can open real pathways to peace. When wars end, two forms of destruction remain. The first is visible, the houses, schools, and bridges that lie in ruins. The second is invisible, yet perhaps more damaging than the first, the erosion of trust between people and between citizens and the state. Bricks and mortar can rebuild buildings, but broken trust requires something else. Acknowledgement, recognition, assurance that tomorrow can and will be different from yesterday. And that is the essence of transitional justice. It's not about revenge, and it's not only about courts and laws. It's about dignity. It's about victims and survivors being heard instead of silenced. It's about societies finding the courage to face hard truths so that old wounds do not fester but begin to heal. And it's about charting a way forward, not drifting, but walking together on a common path. We know from international experience that transitional justice knows no one-size-fits-all model. What helped Rwandans to recover from unspeakable violence would not work for war-affected people in Bosnia, for example, and vice versa, of course. In every case, the lesson is the same. Transitional justice must be rooted in local realities. It must align with the culture, traditions, and practices of reconciliation that already exist in communities. Only then does it feel authentic, and only then does it take root. Transitional justice does not begin nor end at the political level. It starts with people, with grassroots initiatives, with the ways communities know how to mend broken relations, and from there, it grows outwards to engage everyone, people, institutions, and ultimately also the state. This is why civil society is so vital. pathways to peace are not paved by diplomats like myself or officials. They are constructed by local communities, by civil society and activists, by mothers searching for their disappeared sons, and by young people who have the courage to dream of a better future. In Yemen, the work of the Sana Center for Strategic Studies and the Yemen Peace Forum is a powerful example of the important role that is played by civil society. By creating spaces where victims, youth, women, and activists can speak, listen, and shape ideas together, they help ensure that transitional justice is not abstract, but grounded in real lives and are powered by local voices. The Netherlands is proud to support these efforts because we believe that these are the seeds of sustainable peace. Inclusivity in this process is not optional. It is, in fact, essential. Women, youth, marginalized groups, and above all, victims must be part of the process. Their voices give peace its legitimacy. Their experiences make justice real. Without them, peace will remain incomplete, and with them, peace can endure. For Yemen, this is not an abstract debate. The suffering has been immense, but the desire for peace and justice remains strong. The question is not whether transitional justice is needed, but how it can be shaped in a way that belongs to Yemen. That is why this week matters. By coming together, by reflecting, by empowering civil society to be a trailblazer, you are already walking the pathway. Justice is not about the past, it's about the future. A future where differences are managed through dialogue, not conflict, where institutions, not battlefields, carry the burden of disputes, and where every person's dignity is recognized. And that, in my opinion, is the promise of transitional justice, and that's the pathway we should walk together. Thank you. Back to you, Isa.
Thank you very much, Bart, for this opening remark for this session, which truly expresses the importance of transitional justice and also how much of a priority it is for the Netherlands and the support it has given, and the importance of including this and achieving comprehensive peace through transitional justice. We'll now move on to the second topic on the participation of victims in peace negotiations. During this intervention, we'll hear from His Excellency Sergio Jaramillo, who is an architect of transitional justice in Colombia, and he will give us an inspirational overview of the Colombian success. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Sana Center and Peace Forum. We were really delighted to have the Sana Center recently in Colombia, along with some friends from Deeproot, and it's very, very nice to meet again. And thanks to the Dutch Embassy and to Bart for this really excellent initial remarks. I wanted to make 3 or 4 points in our brief time, but before that, I want to say just 1 or 2 things about the importance of what you're doing here today, because as Bart rightly said, these efforts of civil society are really hugely, hugely important to put these themes on the table, to keep awareness, to push the agenda forward. And anything we can do to help with that, we're there to help. I'm particularly encouraged by the things we've done recently in the case of Colombia, which is to begin to have these exchanges and visits. And thanks again to the Dutch Embassy and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, without whom we couldn't have done this. But I think this connection of experience, it's difficult to imagine 2 countries that are more different than Yemen and Colombia. And yet, a lot of the experiences are similar. And dear Shala, who's with us today, or Yasmin, can tell you that, and everyone in Colombia was very impressed by their questions. And that was because they're very intelligent people, but also because their experience somehow mirrors some of the stuff that's also going on in a country as far away as Colombia. So let's keep connecting, because I think that really helps. And my last point is simply, and this may be the main lesson of Colombia, because when you get to a peace agreement, everyone offers you all these explanations of why this happened. But for most of the time of the negotiations, most people think this is actually going to fail. And it was possible to do it. But it was possible to do it because we started thinking and preparing really well ahead of time, and we never lost hope. So this is the main message I would like to leave actually, that things don't happen on their own. You have to keep pushing. And you should beware, and I will say a word more about this in a second, about people who say, well, you need to have meet certain conditions for negotiations. You need to have a so-called mutually hurting stalemate. Everyone needs to feel there's no way out, otherwise you're not going to have a negotiation. That may be true, but it's sometimes not true. It wasn't true in the case of Colombia. And above all, I find it's very harmful because it introduces this idea of passivity. Let's just wait for things to play out in the battlefield or in the political field, and then we'll see whether something happens. No, that's not how it works. The way it works, if you want a result, is you need to start putting building blocks and shaping the space. And no building blocks are more important than the issue of justice and the victims' rights. So I do want to encourage you to continue these efforts and not to lose hope, even though things now may look very, very hard, and they are very hard. But that's where change comes from anticipation and preparation. So I wanted to make 3 or 4 points, and the first one, which I think I made in February in Amman, may seem like a technical thing, but I think that's actually important. And it's more a conceptual point about what are we talking about. And I understand that for the usual reasons, the phrase transitional justice is very established, and we all talk about transitional justice. But I want to make a plea to start talking more about victims and victims' rights instead of talking about transitional justice. And there are a number of reasons for this. There are some, if you like, tactical reasons. So if the day comes when the guys with the guns are actually sitting down and deciding on a peace agreement and what happens in the future, you will find that taking on the issue from the victim's perspective is more productive and less threatening than saying, we're going to go with you after you with transitional justice and accountability. That was our experience. But more strategically, I think that if you take the perspective of victims and their rights, then you can be much more creative in your own definition of what you think is an adequate response to those rights in a transition. The Yemeni response, based on these rights, which are inalienable rights of victims of justice, truth, and reparations. But you need to find your own formula. So I think that if you concentrate on the victims, it gives you more flexibility to come up with your own solution. And above all, I think, again, it is, and this will be my next point, it's really very, very important to start putting victims at the center and giving them voice. And so I am all for this idea of the Victims' Day, which I think is also a better, if I may say so, better description of what you want than a Transitional Justice Day is a day where you think about the victims. So my next point is precisely the importance of preparation. And in the case of Colombia, many things happened before we actually even started talking in secret to the FARC to do with victims. And perhaps the most important one was that a law was passed on victims' rights with a very ambitious program of reparations. At the time, I think maybe still the largest in the world. The Secretary General of the UN came to Colombia for the signing of this bill, Ban Ki-moon, in the summer of 2011. We hadn't even started secret talks with the FARC guerrillas then. And so what this did through this piece of legislation is that it consolidated the demands of the victims movement. And so when it came to talking to the FARC, when we started discussing in secret the agenda, we could say, look, you can say whatever you like. There's no way we can have a negotiation if it does not include a point on victims, because this is the issue. Everyone is talking about this. It's there. It's in the center of attention. So it wasn't just that we were so concerned about victims and that we decided to put this on the agenda, is that the work of the victims' organizations and civil society and the way it had been reflected in previous legislation created the space for us to really pressure this point and say, without this, there's no way we can have a negotiation. Again, this is the Colombian model, but I do think that anticipating and using all these elements to put pressure on taking the victims seriously, including, I know the world's changed. We're seeing things that nobody thought we would ever see before. What's going on just an hour's flight from Yemen and Gaza is absolutely unbelievable. It's in some ways the destruction of international humanitarian law. But still, things are not going to stay like that. the world will start taking more, and it is taking more note of what's going on. And all these are sources of pressure. In our case, we had to take very seriously the fact that we are signatories of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And so what we did in our case, the phrase I normally use is we used limitations as enablers. Things that seemed like there were obstacles, we used them to sort of limit the space and say, look, this is the space we have to do something. We have to come up with a solution that satisfies Article 17 of the Rome Statute. Otherwise, we're all going to have a problem, and this is not going to be stable. That was again in the case of Colombia. But the larger point I want to go back to again is the importance of preparation, anticipation, giving victims voice, and not falling into the wrong sequence of thinking that you have to wait for there to be a formal negotiation, for certain things to be discussed, for victims to have voice. I think you have to start well ahead and start creating the pressure. Otherwise, this is not going to happen. Now, on the particular point, my next point of victims' participation, what we did, and I sometimes say it was probably the most innovative part of the Colombian peace negotiation, was to actually have victims come and speak directly at the negotiating table. Not as negotiators, because that would be a mistake, but to give to the negotiating parties their views directly. Now, we had established a system in our negotiations whereby every time we discussed a point of the agenda, and there were 5 points of the substantive points of the agenda, one to do with rural development, one to do with victims, one to do with the issue of drugs and illicit economies, DDR, and political participation. We would ask the UN and a university to organize a large conference in Colombia to get people's views and send them to Cuba, to Havana, where we were negotiating. In a way, it was kind of a small version of the very ambitious national dialogue you ran in Yemen more than 10 years ago, 13 years ago, whenever that was. But when it came to victims, it wasn't enough. We felt it wasn't enough. So far as I know, for the first time ever, we actually agreed to have victims come and address the negotiating table directly. And victims, this is a very important point, that were not picked or selected by the negotiating parties, but by a third neutral, credible party, which in our case was a combination of the Catholic Church, the UN, and the largest public university. So we put it in their hands for them to pick the victims. And what happened was something that was transformative. Not because it changed all the substance of the negotiation, but because it made it obvious to everyone why it was that we were there sitting down trying to end the war, what this meant, and the moral responsibility we all had to put an end to this conflict. So in a way, the victims, if I may use that language, became the moral and even the spiritual center of this whole negotiation. And that was thanks to the fact that they came, and they then ended up being not all of them, because victims are not a homogeneous movement. There's no reason why they should be, but a large number of them ended up being the most important ambassadors and defenders of this negotiation. This was a very important point, because in many parts of the world, this has worked the other way around. For example, in Spain, when there was an effort to resolve the Basque problem in the 2000s, the opposition party, the PP, politicized the victims movement against any efforts at talking to the ETA and those armed groups. So there's always a risk of the victims movements being politicized. And we were aware of that. And that's why we want to make sure that they were also brought in. And lastly, my last point is then you have to come up with your own institutional response to this. And here's where things have to be different, because every country is different. They have different legal systems. Colombia is a very legalistic country with a strong judicial system that has a problem that does not extend over all of the Colombian territory, but it is very robust in let's say, most of the consolidated country. And so we had to come up with something that was credible, and that's what we came up with, this thing which you've Sada and others heard about in Bogota, about a so-called comprehensive system where we had a truth commission, especially we had a new peace tribunal that issued special sentences. And we also created a unit to look for the disappeared. Now, some of these elements may be of interest in Yemen, some may be just too complex, and I wouldn't recommend to anyone to copy this because it's a system that is too complex. But there are elements that may be useful. For example, the issue of the disappeared is Bart mentioned it is an issue in any conflict, and coming up with the right formula for this is not easy. There's a lot of pressure to make sure that those special units contribute to accountability, and this is important, but it has to be careful. In our case, we ended up, and we can talk about that in another occasion, coming up with a formula whereby the results of the search of a special search unit would contribute to the legal process, but it would still be an extrajudicial mechanism, so that people could talk to it without fear of being prosecuted, and so that it fulfilled its primary objective, which was a humanitarian one of looking for the missing. So that's a kind of simple example. But I think, and I will end with this, that the challenge for Yemen is to think about what would be its own model, and perhaps given the nature of the problem, not necessarily all as formal as in Colombia. It may be a more decentralized model. It may be the things you start doing now. And I will end with that. There's no time to lose. There's no time to lose. Solutions may look like they're far away, but if you start building now, if you start putting the subject on the table now, if people start becoming more and more aware that victims' rights cannot be ignored, you'll have a much better chance at success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for this very insightful and inspiring experience, and one that really inspires us to think about the best way to apply elements and parts and lessons learned of these experiences, not just from Colombia, but others, to one that is more useful for the Yemeni context. Thank you very much for that, for your remarks. And we'll now start with the third part of the session, where we will hand over the microphone to the Office of the UN Special Envoy. Just yesterday, the UN Special Envoy, Office of the UN Special Envoy, issued a statement on the arrest of 11 employees of UN agencies in Yemen. We know that enforced disappearance and detentions are used to pressure local and international actors. And if this issue is not dealt with decisively, and if it is left for the political negotiations, then there will be a continued sense of impunity. And this is where the role of the United Nations comes in, to stand alongside justice and alongside the interests of the victims. And so we move on to the third part of our session, the UN Special Envoy's Office, presented by Shada Al-Harazi. Over to you, Shada. Thank you. Thank you very much, Isa. Thank you for this very important opportunity and for this very important activity. I think it is important to build momentum for transitional justice and other issues linked to the hopes and aspirations of society as a whole and of victims specifically for a better future. What I wanted to speak about, and based on what has already been presented by the panelists who have spoken before me, and specifically on the Colombian experience, is how we can try to open a path towards transitional justice. And based on the conclusion of Sergio's remarks, that work on transitional justice needs to start now, no matter how far things might seem. And also based on what you've said, Isa, that these violations, these crimes continue to accumulate. The sense that the various parties to the conflict have that through these violations, through these crimes, they will be able to make gains, and that this is the way that they should deal with society. And without having clear frameworks for the protection of civilians, for the protection of victims, then the situation will continue as it is, if not get much worse. one of the most insightful things I found from the Colombian experience is the point that Sergio talked about, that we need to begin preparations for all of these aspects well in advance, to prepare the institutions, prepare the necessary resources, prepare the legal frameworks, think about how we can ensure that victims' voices are heard on the negotiations table. And this is something that requires much preparation and efforts. The situation in Yemen, or the context in Yemen, is different. Like many other conflicts, people continue to believe that transitional justice is one of the issues that will be discussed during the transitional or post-conflict period, after the parties have already negotiated. And this might make some rational sense, because usually the implementation of transitional justice requires consensual political will, and that it is going to be an attempt to transition from a conflict into a new future that does not repeat the cycles of conflict, and that this will be able to achieve reassurances for society and for victims. But the reality in Yemen is that the parties to the conflict have not met at a comprehensive negotiating tables since the negotiations in Kuwait in 2016. And so the question now is, how can we open up the pathways to transitional justice, and what can be done now? Can we start by taking steps, even if very small steps, that help lay the groundwork for justice, so that when the parties to the conflict go to a comprehensive political negotiations, there already is a groundwork? And I think the Colombian experience shows us that whenever there is a political will, the work will start. And so it's important for us to start taking steps towards building that political will by adopting the initiatives and activities of victims associations and civil society organizations, and using them to push towards the implementation of transitional justice. In the Yemeni context, transitional justice is a more modern concept. It started since the GCC initiative in 2011. And since it was presented, it has had two aspects that or factors that impact how it is accepted or rejected by the political actors. And unlike many other cases where the perpetrators of the crime are a very specific group and the victims are the rest of society, but in Yemen, with the different cycles of conflict, every one of these rounds, the victims of the previous round become the perpetrators of the next round, and so on and so forth. And so discussions of the time frame that will be covered by transitional justice, when discussing the time frame of the transitional justice, each actor wants to exclude the time frame in which they were the perpetrators of these violations. And this is one of the first steps that will need to be taken in transitional justice in Yemen. And they try, by hindering these discussions on the time frame, to hinder the process as a whole. Secondly, the Yemeni political actors have used transitional justice as a means of political bargaining with the other political actors. And they have also used their media to try to instill this understanding. And this is why, to many Yemenis and maybe to the Yemeni public, that transitional justice is a tool to be used for revenge, or at least to stigmatize one of the other actors as having been the ones that committed the perpetration or perpetrated the violations. And so whenever the concept of transitional justice is brought up, the idea is that one side is going to be the perpetrator and the others are the victims. And even to translate the word justice in Yemen, of the fact that this aims to create justice for everyone and ensure that this is the only guarantee for all of us, that none of our rights will be violated, and that the transition in transitional justice means a transition to a new stage, one with a better future and sustainable peace. And so this takes us back to the question, should transitional justice wait until further notice? Should we wait until the warring parties go to comprehensive negotiations? Because transitional justice, for its implementation, requires a peaceful settlement, but there are steps that need to be taken now. We cannot postpone everything until then. And so we need to work towards building the political will starting now. How can we do this? Sergio spoke about the importance of how we use these concepts or the terminology, and how this can give us the flexibility, and so that the actors do not feel that this is purposefully designed to target them. And also taking steps that everyone feels like they have an interest in. We need to turn those who are afraid of these steps into partners, and those the groups that are afraid now are the decision makers. They are the ones who might include transitional justice in the negotiations or not. We at the United Nations, through all of the work that we do and all of our activities, are committed to transitional justice. Civil society is our main partner in this, and victims associations are also our partners in this. But if the political actors do not accept this, then this work will be very difficult, if not impossible. And so we need to turn those who are afraid of transitional justice into partners. And since every one of these actors was a victim at one point throughout Yemen's modern history, I think is an excellent entry point for us into this process. And with regards to transitional justice, there are two efforts that are not equal. There are the efforts with civil society, which is our core partner, as I've mentioned, in addition to the victims, to create a transitional justice process that is in line with society's aspirations and help lead to less politicized options. And civil society organizations have made significant strides in their perspectives and in the work that they do with society, as well as in the technical capacities in monitoring and documentation, or in their work in forming associations. But what is more important than this, and this is something that I always find interesting, is the ability of civil society organizations to work with all victims, regardless of who the perpetrator is. And so they've gone beyond the idea of that we should form a victims association because we are victims of the same perpetrator. We do not recognize the victims of others. But no, the victims have all come together and worked together because they recognize the suffering that they have all gone through, regardless of who the perpetrator is. And this is a very advanced step in my view. But without bridging this very fruitful efforts and a real political will that these perspectives will help design, then all of the work that civil society has done will be diminished over time. And so it's important for us to bridge between civil society organizations and their efforts and political actors on the scene. And this bridge will need to be taken this work would need to be taken step by step, and it needs to start immediately. Just as people have started to accept the concept of victims and trying to find less contentious terms for this, we need to start working with what is possible, what steps that can be taken. And I would like to reiterate what the two panelists have said previously, that throughout all of these stages, victims must be central to it. Not because they will be beneficiaries from the outcomes of this process, but as designers and as planners for the process as a whole, to ensure that their voices are heard throughout all of the stages of the process. I believe that the biggest challenge pertaining to transitional justice now, or one of the biggest challenges, is if nothing happens, if no action is taken, if we believe that nothing can be resolved before everything is resolved at once. I think this is an incorrect understanding, and we need to correct it for ourselves and for the political actors. There are many issues that would need to be discussed from a technical perspective, from a human rights perspective, or even from a political perspective, and creating mechanisms for these discussions at an early stage is very important. It's important for us to try to find which steps might achieve a consensus. So, for example, discussions on reparations. What are reparations? What are its determinants? What are the factors and conditions for its implementation? And also, how can it be funded? There are many, many more victims in Yemen than any previous period, while at the same time the state has become weaker, with less resources and more fragile. During the National Dialogue Conference, there were always very quick discussions over this topic, that the state would be the one to compensate. And the Yemeni state was very weak back then, and now it is even much weaker. And so these discussions are very important to try to come up with creative and innovative ideas. What are some of the examples from other experiences for reparations? That's a very important discussion. How can we start by documenting the victims? Why should we wait for a political process for us to document and create a victims registry? Can we start these discussions now? Even if there is already documentation by civil society organizations, if it is not politically acceptable, or if it is accused of being politicized or inaccurate, then all of this will go to waste. And so we need to have a discussion for how can we create mechanisms that are politically accepted, that recognize these efforts and build upon them, and that these are efforts that are supportive of the institutions that will operate in the future. We also need to discuss what these institutions will look like, what institutions or bodies need to be formed, what need to be be reformed? And can this reform process start now with the lack of a comprehensive political agreement? And finally, I wanted to speak about the role of youth, women, and civil society organizations. Youth are the most important factor in all of this, because the Yemeni population, a majority of the Yemeni population are youth, and youth do not bear the burdens of the past and these conflicts from the past. And I think youth are better able to overcome political differences, and because they see that this future is a future that they will have to live through, and they aspire for a better future. And civil society can also contribute to designing different programs on this process relating to the discussions that we mentioned, including reparations and institutional reform that reflect local needs. And youth can lead these dialogues that do not focus on naming and blame, but ensure non-repetition. Dialogues that focus on justice through its true meaning, and not as a way in a way to try to recover, but more than anything else. And for these dialogues to focus on giving hope and not political point scoring. And this has been going on for a long time. There are whole media organizations and channels that the political actors use to accuse each other of being the perpetrator of these crimes, and we need to leave this cycle. And finally, we need to provide support these youth, not just through funding, but also by giving them the position to design this process. And like Bart said, the transitional justice process is not about victors and the defeated. It's about restoring dignity. It's about restoring trust in institutions and creating a future that is more safe and secure and dignified for everyone. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much, Shada, for this very rich intervention on all aspects, especially the last part where you spoke about the importance of youth and this process, as youth are an important part of designing the future, and they do not bear the same burdens and the hatred that from previous cycles of conflict. We'll now move on to the fourth topic of our discussion, which will be presented by my colleague Shema Hamid. Over to you, Shema. Thank you very much, Isa, and I would like to thank all of the participants and the other panelists. Transitional Justice campaign towards the adoption of a day for transitional justice. Amid the ongoing conflict and its catastrophic consequences for Yemenis, transitional justice emerges as one of the most essential pathways to peace in Yemen, because it is the only road to achieving a genuine and comprehensive peace that places victims at the heart of the justice process, acknowledges them in the violations that they have endured, and works to provide reparations for the harm they have suffered and guarantees the non-recurrence of these violations. From our perspective, as young people who have lived through this conflict since its beginning and witnessed numerous violations and victims at the hands of various parties, we see that the issue of transitional justice still has a very limited presence, whether in public discourse, policy, or even in peace consultations. Therefore, driven by our sense of responsibility as youth, sorry, can everyone hear me? Yeah, it's clear. Please continue, Shema. Therefore, driven by our sense of responsibility as youth, the idea for the Transitional Justice campaign, which includes the demand to establish a national day for transitional justice in Yemen, was born. This is a youth-led project within the Yemen Peace Forum in partnership with the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies. Through this week, we seek to bring the issue of transitional justice to the national stage, broaden the discussion around it, and push for it to become a priority in all peace pathways. We have chosen to highlight transitional justice for several reasons. The first is because we represent one of the groups most affected by the war, and at the same time, as youth, we are the most capable and eager to shape Yemen's future differently. Second, because transitional justice provides us with the ability to deconstruct the causes of the conflict and build a collective memory based on acknowledgement, this enhances the chances of reconciliation and reduces the divisions that threaten any future political agreement. Third, because the experiences of many countries have proven that adopting transitional justice mechanisms is the gateway to genuine reconciliation. And so we have designed this initiative to include a range of activities that achieve multiple objectives. Most importantly, enhancing young people's knowledge of transitional justice concepts and empowering them with the necessary skills and abilities to advocate for it, while also gathering a broad database on the active parties in the field of transitional justice, in addition to producing media content that reflects the importance of this issue and expresses the demands and voices of the victims. Today, we, as youth and civil society organizations, call on everyone to commemorate the 1st of September of each year as a day for transitional justice in Yemen. We affirm that this day should be an annual milestone for societal mobilization dedicated to entrenching a reconciliation based on justice and fairness, truth-seeking, accountability, reparations, and of course, amplifying the voices of victims and their families. The importance of adopting this day lies in solidifying the recognition of victims and the violations that they have endured, while commemorating their memories and unifying civil society efforts around transitional justice. It also serves as an important annual opportunity for dialogue on reconciliation and peace building, reminding future generations that justice is an indispensable condition for achieving sustainable peace and that the memory of the victims is an essential part of the identity of future Yemen. The choice of this date was not arbitrary. It is linked to the global momentum on August 30th to commemorate the victims of enforced disappearance, one of the most heinous crimes against humanity. In our name, as the organizations and youth of the Yemen Peace Forum, we call on all actors involved in the peace process to 1. Adopt a day for transitional justice in Yemen within their official calendars to serve as an annual milestone for recognizing victims and unifying efforts towards comprehensive transitional justice. Second, integrate transitional justice into every negotiation track and any future political agreement, as it is a fundamental pillar for achieving sustainable peace. Third, acknowledging the violations and adopting clear mechanisms for reparations and compensation for victims and their families. Fourth, ensure the effective participation of victims while removing all barriers to the participation of women, youth, and marginalized groups. Fifth, develop legislative and institutional frameworks that enable the implementation of transitional justice on the ground. Sixth, empower civil society organizations and youth initiatives through funding and capacity building to enhance their leading role. Seventh, place the interests and dignity of victims at the core of all efforts and policies related to transitional justice. And the eighth and final point is supporting a professional, responsible, and conflict-sensitive media that contributes to spreading a culture of justice and peace building. Today, we call on everyone to be partners in these demands, and for each one of us to carry the voice of the victims into every public, social, and political space at all levels. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shema, for this remark on behalf of the Yemen Peace Forum team on the efforts to raise awareness about the concept of transitional justice and increase awareness about it through the campaigns and initiatives that had been implemented, and as well as through the activities of Transitional Justice Week. I wanted to ask a question to our panelists. Bart, the Deputy Head of Mission, and also to His Excellency Sergio and Shada. I wanted to ask you a question on the importance of having a day for transitional justice in conflict-affected countries, especially Yemen. I wanted to hear our panelists' perspective on the importance of dedicating a day to transitional justice. Could I start with you, Bart?
Sure. From my perspective, it's important to sort of earmark a day where you emphasize the positive topic, but of course it's a topic that should be on the agenda every day. How it can help is bring people together, have this discussion that we're having this week and also during this session, to exchange ideas about how to implement it in Yemen. Learn from experiences and these sort of things. So I think for the sake of exchanging, days like these are very important. Having said that, of course, the topic should be high on the agenda 364 days of the year after this one. Back to you.
شكرا أستاذ
Thank you very much, Bart.
سيد سيرخيو.
Sergio?
Yes, thank you very much. I think what a day like this can help to achieve is a change in perspective. Because normally you're concentrating on the armed actors, the guys with the guns, who have to end the conflict. But if you start talking about the victims, then you start looking at the other side of the coin. And if you do this in an inclusive way, and if you include all victims, and Shada made the key point that what you want is slowly for victims to start noticing that even though they may be victims of different actors at different points in time, because the point was also made, when you have a long conflict like Yemen, where do you start? But then what happened in the case of Colombia, and this really was something that the victims that came to the negotiation table told us, was that it was only at that moment when they were talking amongst themselves after having spoken to us, the negotiators, that they realized that it didn't matter so much whose victim they were. What mattered is that they all shared this suffering and they wanted this to stop. And they wanted also the rights to be taken seriously. So again, it may sound counterintuitive, but the more and more I think about this, and especially in a case like Yemen, where things may not work out in such a structured way, I think the way to think about this is not, oh, let's wait to have a big negotiation and then work on reconciliation and victims, but the other way around. Let's start giving victims voice, acknowledging victims, getting victims to understand that they actually have this shared suffering and that they become an agent for change, peace, and justice.
شكرا سيد سيرخيو.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Shada? Thank you very much, Isa, for this question. I agree with what both Bart and Sergio have said, but I wanted to add an additional point. I believe this is an important opportunity to create momentum for this discussion, to introduce or define what these activities are and how transitional justice is implemented. But there are two questions here. The first is, how can you expand this discussion? Because this is a group that has not been included in the past with regards to the victims or even the political actors. The idea is, how can you use this day every year to create more momentum and to expand it more and more? And secondly is the point that Sergio mentioned of, where do we start? Do we start with the concepts or the terminology that already has the people have already prejudged or already have their own understanding of, or should we try to take this step by step, where during each period or during each year you focus on a specific aspect or specific points, or do we need to be more flexible in dealing with this terminology? Because like I said before, transitional justice, for example, and I know, like Bart said, it's not about a victor and a loser coin, but how can we bring all of these together to try to build this momentum and then use this as an opportunity to build on that year in and year out? Thank you. We can't hear you, Isa. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shada, for that answer. Thank you to Bart and Sergio as well. In conclusion, in this opening session of the Transitional Justice Conference, I would like to thank all of our panelists for their time and for their remarks, for shining a light on different aspects of transitional justice. I would also like to thank our audience for the questions that they presented. Unfortunately, this is the opening session. We will not have time for questions and answers, but we can have a discussion in the next session. We will meet you in half an hour in the second session, which will be on the civil society's role in shaping pathways to transitional justice and memorialization. This session will be facilitated by Mohammed Al-Harbi, and its speakers will be Samah Subay' and Alawiya Saqaf. We call on you to be with us at this session. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for your contributions. Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you all. Really appreciate it.